Welcome, folks. Today's lecture is on splits, and we're going to be covering splits in the context of spring splits, splits to help you manage swarms, and also splits that you can use to raise queens. And so what I want you to start by thinking is that splits are a tool that you use to participate in a lot of the natural activities that bees are going to do anyways. And so, for example, one of them would be swarming, right? And so we can do splits to prevent swarming in general, and we do splits as part of the normal reproductive cycle of bees in the spring. So splits are something that you can use throughout the season as a mechanism to help you work with your bees and manage them appropriately. So let's start with what a split is. So a split really is as basic as it comes. It is the reproduction of colonies from a donor colony. So you have a colony that overwinters, and typically when we're talking about splits, particularly in the context of spring, we're talking about that natural reproductive cycle that happens in the spring. And what we're doing is we're taking a large colony and we're turning it into many colonies through donation of resources. And those resources are going to be brood and food and space in the form oftentimes of drawn comb. So splits are something that we use as beekeepers to take advantage of these large colonies and be able to sustainably increase the size of our operations or sell those to other folks in the spring. And us as an example, Bee Wise Farms, we last year sold 80 nukes that were splits from our overwintered colonies. And so this can also become part of a business, these splits. Now, typically when you're selling splits in the form of nukes, you're usually charging around $200 a colony. So you can make a lot of really good money right at the beginning of the season. And that's really important to understand, because in the beginning of the season, as a beekeeper and as a farmer in general, is when you are bleeding money. You're buying seed, you're prepping soil, you're doing all of these activities. You're buying equipment in the form of beekeeping equipment. You're doing all these activities that cost a lot of money. And so if you can recoup some of that money at the beginning of the season, that allows you to invest into your operation early on and not have to wait all the way to the end of the season for honey money. So as part of a business strategy, splits are also an important part of that. And splits are really the way that you create long-term success in beekeeping. Overwintered colonies turn into many. So one colony turns into many, and you either sell those or you increase the size of your operation. And that's how most of us in the beekeeping industry that are able to get our colonies to survive really have done well. I mean, we bought 6 colonies a decade ago when we moved to Michigan, after we'd sold everything in California. And the thing that, really we've experienced since then is we've been able to sustainably increase the size of our apiary without purchasing new bees, and to supply bees to our local community through splits. So it's a really important part of beekeeping. Now, why do we do splits? And I touched on a few of these. Well, we do these to take advantage of the natural reproductive cycle at the colony level. Remember, colonies are going to reproduce naturally after they come through the winter. And they do that through swarming or through splits. And so you have a choice. Well, let's say you don't have a choice. You don't have a choice whether you're going to split or not. The colony will split for you if you don't. And they'll split in the form of a swarm. Now, when you have a colony that swarms, you lose half of your bees and you have a new queen that's being raised back home. This is not a great situation. You want to keep yourself from getting in those situations. And the way that you do that with overwintered colonies is through splits. So you can use splits to produce nukes. You can increase the number of your colonies if you don't want to sell bees, but you want to, increase the size of your apiary. You can recover from your overwintering losses. So if you say, for example, you had an apiary of 10 colonies and 5 of them made it through, you could easily recover those losses that you had from the previous year through splits of those 5 colonies that made it through. You can also raise queens with splits as well, and taking advantage of those times when you find queen cells that are active. When you find those, you can actually take advantage of that situation and make a split to raise a queen. So queen raising splits. You can also use splits to prevent overcrowding and swarming. And so in this lecture, what we're going to be talking about is all 3 of these situations. Splits in the form of increasing colonies, producing nukes, recovering from losses is one category. Raising queens is another one. And swarming, prevention of swarming through splits is another. So, excuse me, let's jump into this. Okay, so let's start with the needs of your splits and timing of your splits. So in the context of the beginning of the season, when we're talking about spring splits, the things you are going to need before you even get started, you're going to need either a queen or eggs. And what I mean by that is you have to have some way for the colony to become queen right. Now, you can add a mated queen early in the season, and generally those are purchased from suppliers in the south or out west, because in the north, we don't have the weather to raise queens that early in the season. We always have to import early season queens to do splits because we just don't have the weather to get mated queens here. So you're going to need either a mated queen that you've purchased from somewhere, or you're going to need a frame of eggs from the donor colony. And the reason you need eggs is because from eggs, the colony can raise its own queen. Now, remember from our biology background that to raise a queen from egg to a mated laying queen is a 4 to 5 week process. So the difference here is timing as far as how quickly this is going to establish. If you add a mated queen, you're going to have a queen right colony in less than a week. If you raise your own queen with eggs, you have a month-long process or more that you need to go through before you ever get new brood on. So these are considerations you have to make before you dive into doing splits. You need to make this decision. The difference between the two, well, when you add a queen, this is basically a typical situation where we add a mated queen, or when you're just adding eggs, we call these walkaway splits. When you're not adding a queen, you're walking away and letting them raise their own queen. The next thing you need is you need to understand, do I have drones that are flying? So if you don't buy a mated queen, not only do you need eggs, but you also have to have a drone population in the area before your queen can ever get mated. So if you're taking a really early season split and the flying weather's not good, the drone populations are low, you can have a failed queen from being raised because the conditions and the timing is not right as far as drone population. So you have to observe what's going on in the colonies in your yard to determine, do I even have drones in the landscape? And if there's drones in your colonies, you got drones in the landscape. You're also going to need pollen and nectar. Now, pollen and nectar may be one in limited supply due to weather, and usually we're doing splits right when the weather gets good. So oftentimes we have ups and downs in days where there's many days where bees can't fly. So oftentimes, and most commonly, you're going to be adding pollen to these colonies and nectar in the form of sugar water. So you want to, if you can, when you're doing these splits, you like to be able to get a full frame of pollen, a full frame of nectar. But depending on where you're at in the northern United States, it really is going to have an impact on what you have in that colony. So for example, here in the Upper Peninsula, we generally do splits. Usually our timing ends up being right around the end of May. Usually around Memorial Day is when we end up doing splits here. That's when the weather ends up being good enough to actually do this activity. Because before that, it's usually too cold to even dig into the colonies. So oftentimes when we are just getting good enough weather to do splits, there really has not been a ton of flying activity. And so the resources in the colony may not be huge. That is completely different at different latitudes. If you go further south, you get a lot of better flying days during the time when a lot of our trees are flowering, like our soft maples, which are some of the first things that flower out in the landscape. And so if you're in a warmer area that has less snow, less bad weather, you may end up doing splits when there is pollen and nectar in the colony. And generally, you're going to find some, but it's just not going to be in ample amounts in some of the far northern areas. But you are always going to want to be thinking about feeding as you do this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You also want lots of young bees. Lots of young bees are very important to the success of splits. The reason is your nurse bees are the bees that take care of the nursery. They're also the bees that don't fly. They are not foragers. They have not left the colony yet. And so you want lots of young bees. And by lots of young bees, typically what you're looking for are big brood frames that just hatched, brood frames that have lots of larvae in them. Those are going to be the ones that have lots of nurse bees on them because they're feeding the nursery or they're just hatching. So these are things to think about. You're also going to want the proper arrangement. You're going to have to put this together like a colony when you build these splits. And you have to know the proper order and proper arrangement of the frames in a brood chamber, because that's what we're going to be building as a brood chamber when we do this. And then finally, you got to have good weather. You can't be doing this in cold weather. Your colonies oftentimes will fail in cold weather. If you're pulling brood frames out in, say, 50-degree weather, you're going to chill those brood frames. They're just going to die, and you're not going to get any bees out of them. And it's going to be a whole lot of work for that split to clean those frames out. So make sure the weather is good. Typically, I like to see nighttime temperatures above freezing and daytime temperatures in the high 50s to low 60s is usually what we're looking for. But you want to make sure it's a sunny day, that the actual feeling of the temperature is much warmer than the high 50s, low 60s. You want it to be a nice, clear, not windy day that feels warm outside to you. If you're comfortable outside, say a t-shirt or a light sweatshirt, you're probably fine for doing splits. But don't do it in bad weather. You're just gonna have failure on your hands. Okay, so these are the splits that we're going to cover. We're going to cover a 5-frame split. This is also known as a nuke in the industry. It's short for hive nucleus, which is essentially like the nucleus of the colony. We're also going to be talking about walkaway splits, typical splits, even splits, side-by-side splits. I'm going to teach you about a swarm prevention split known as the Demaree method, a queen rearing split, and, well, there's so many more that we can't even touch on today, but there's lots of ways to split a colony. The concept is pretty general, though. And let's start with the 5-frame split, a nuke. This is as basic as it gets. 5 frames that you're putting together in an arrangement of a small brood chamber. This is a fully functioning colony. And that's the unique thing about splits and nukes as we sell them in the industry is nuke versus package. If you are familiar with both of these, you understand that a package is essentially a box of bees. It's a swarm kind. You can think of it as a swarm. There's no resources. There's no comb. There's no wax. There's nothing in there as far as food is concerned. It's a ball of bees with a queen. A nuke is a fully functioning bee colony. It has brood, it has eggs, it has food, and it has space to grow. So when we are taking 5-frame splits, and this is, again, the most basic form of splitting a colony, this is what you're going to be building. So you have your 5 frames in this box. This is typically how a lot of us sell nukes. This is a Jester bee box, nuke box, and we sell all of our nukes in these packages. So this is what you get when you purchase a nuke from somebody. And keep in mind, quality nukes are not always the case with a lot of suppliers, especially small suppliers. If you have someone that's supplying, I'd say 50 or more nukes, generally they're probably doing a good job. When you get into folks that are selling 1 or 2 of these things, this can be really dicey, but this is what you should get in this box. You should be getting a frame of eggs. And as we build the colony, I'm saying it, you should be getting, but this is also how you build the colony. So how do you build this colony? First, you start with a frame of eggs from your donor colony. It needs to be a robust frame of eggs because this is going to be a workforce in 21 days or so. And so you want to make sure that you have plenty of workforce that's going to be available in 3 weeks. So a frame of eggs. You're also going to want to see a frame of emerging brood, meaning older brood, and young brood, meaning uncapped brood. So you want to see basically what you're looking for when it comes to the middle of this is you're looking for all stages of brood, egg, larval, and pupal, which is the cap brood. So you're looking for all 3 stages of those. And that's what you want to see in here. And that's what you want to put in here when you're building out your nuke. The last thing that you're going to have is a food frame, which is going to be pollen and nectar generally. And you always want the pollen side facing in towards the brood. If it's a split frame, you get a lot of frames that are on the edge of the brood chamber in colonies that will have pollen on one side and honey on the other. That's the ideal frame for this. And then you want one frame that's open. And usually you want that to be a drawn frame if you have it, because you want them to be able to have space to expand. This is exactly what a full-size bee colony looks like in miniature. That's why it's called a hive nucleus or a nuke. So this is the most basic form of a split that you have. This is what I do. And this is also how we create new colonies in our operation. When we do splits for nuke production in the spring, we usually do we always do 20% more than we're going to sell, because you're always going to have some of these that just aren't going to work out. And what we do is that, we sell the good ones, and then we keep the 20% that has problems, and we fix the problems and then establish them as new colonies. And that's how we establish our expansion of our operation every single year. And so this is a really nice way to be able to produce colonies that are manageable as far as size, and that you can also incorporate into your operation. Say, for example, you don't sell all your nukes. This is a fully functioning colony. You just drop it into a box and you're off to the races. So it's really nice from that standpoint as well, especially as a producer. Let's talk about the walkaway split. Okay, so the walkaway split is just like it sounds. It's you just walk away. Essentially, this is what we're looking at here in this graphic. Is I'm trying to illustrate two deeps here, and the circle that you see in the middle is the brood. Okay, so this is our overwintered colony while we're getting ready for split. So we have two boxes that are essentially the same thing. They've got brood in them, they've got resources in them. So that is pretty easy to split, right? Well, what we do in this is we take each one of those boxes and we put a bottom board down, take the hive bodies, split them apart, put one on each stand, and put a top cover on it. And now you have two colonies. The trick to this is you don't even have to look for the queen in this walkaway split. This is by far the easiest split that you're going to be able to do. And this is just something you do in your own apiary. This is not, I mean, you could sell one of these as a full colony, but this is typically for something you're just going to expand in your own apiary, whereas the nuke, the 5-frame split, is more for production, for sales. So this particular situation here, you have two boxes. You didn't find the queen when you were doing this, because you literally just separate the boxes and put them on two stands when you understand that you have the resources you need in each one. What you do is 4 days later, you're going to come back to these boxes and you're going to look for eggs. One of them is going to have eggs and one of them is not. And once you find the one that has eggs, you know that's the one that has the queen in it. Because remember, the length of time a colony, or the length of time an individual is an egg, is 3 days. So if you, at that point, you have a choice. I know which one is queenless. I can let it raise its own queen because I made sure there was eggs in there, and they can raise a queen from eggs. Or at this point in time, I could turn this into a typical split, which is the same exact process. We just add a mated queen to the queenless colony. And again, what I had mentioned earlier is that by adding a queen to a queenless colony, you are saving yourselves about 4 weeks of work. If you decide to let them raise their own queen, you're going to give this colony 4 to 5 weeks before you do anything to it, even check on it. You're just going to leave it alone. You're going to come back 4 or 5 weeks later, and you're either going to have a laying queen or a queenless colony, depending on if she made it back from her mating flight or not, which usually is about 80% of the time she makes it back. A lot of predation out there with a big old queen flying in the air. So just keep that in mind. For northern beekeepers, I always recommend doing adding a mated queen. 4 to 5 weeks is a long time in our seasons. We may have 5 months of good weather for bees to fly. You're literally losing about a quarter of the season by raising your own queens. Now, if you have queens that are dynamite and you really want the genetics, go for it. But if your strategy is to save a little money, to not buy mated queens, it is well worth the $30 to $40 you're going to spend on a queen to that for that 4 to 5 weeks to gain that 4 to 5 weeks in your honey season or your beekeeping season. The next split is an even split. This is a pretty simple split that primarily is focused on directionality of entrances. So you can see that I have an arrow here at the bottom that says south. This is the direction this hive is facing. Your hive can face any direction, but the concept is that you're trying to confuse the bees by changing the direction of the entrances to the colonies that you're splitting this from. Basically, what we have here in this image is we've got a hive that has 2 deeps and 2 mediums on it that came through the winter. So you got a lot of bees in this thing. What you're going to do is your bees are out flying around doing their thing. You're going to add you're going to basically split this into 2 different directions. So we were facing south initially with the donor hive. Now we are going to split that into 2 colonies, and we're going to face them against one another in a different fashion than the facing south. We're going to face them east and west. So we build our colonies into 2. And the concept behind the even split is you've evenly split the resources between the 2 colonies, number 1. But number 2 is when the bees come back, they're confused because the donor colony is not there. Now you put the colonies you donated to, your splits, right in front of where the donor colony was. They're just facing a different direction. And so just like you saw in my amazing animation, all of these bees, as they're coming back, the donor colony is not there anymore. And so they have to make a decision, and what we believe is about they evenly split the decision of which colony they go to. Now, again, you're going to have one of these colonies is not going to have a queen. You have the choice at that point. Go back after 4 days, or on 4 days after you did this, check for eggs. One's going to have eggs. One will not. And you're going to either add a queen or raise a queen with the colony that does not have a queen. Side-by-side split, very similar to the even split. The difference is that we don't face the colonies that we donate to in different directions than the donor colony. What we do is we split the difference right in front of the donor colony. So you got your bees, you're literally going to split this in 2, splitting resources between the 2 splits, and you're going to basically stack them right in front of the donor colony. And as the bees come back, foragers come back, they're going to make a decision. Which one do I go to? It's hard to know because the colony is basically, you have 2 colonies that are in the space where one was originally, and they evenly split themselves among the 2. So these are very basic splits. There's a lot of different styles of splits, but what I would say is that this is about the easiest split these splits that I've shown you today, about the easiest you can do for a beginning beekeeper. Number 1, because you don't have to locate the queen ever during this process. You just have to be able to see eggs when you go back and check on them. Big thing I'll leave you with, it is well worth spending the money on a mated queen in northern climates. It just is. You're saving yourself, again, 4 to 5 weeks of time where you're going to be broodless. Now, that's just something that you have to decide on, but it's something you need to decide on before you start doing your splits, okay? All right, so let's jump into swarm prevention splits. And what I'm going to talk about today in the context of swarm prevention splits is a method that was developed by George Demaree in 1892 called the Demaree method. And essentially what we're doing in the Demaree method, this is a method that we use when we find a colony that's about ready to swarm. So a colony that has active swarm cells on it. So you saw in the picture previously, you're going to come to a colony, it's going to be bursting full of bees. You're going to find capped queen cells all over the place, or uncapped cells that are active, meaning that there's larvae in them, not just queen cups that don't have anything in them, but queen cells that have something in them. So when you find a condition like this, you come to a colony and you see that it is going to swarm. It is on its way to a swarm. For most folks, the reaction is that we just kill all the swarm cells, but invariably you're going to miss one or two of those and it's still going to swarm. And you haven't taken care of the issue, which is overcrowding in this situation, by just killing queen cells. They're just going to put more on. And this is going to be a fight that you're going to have for some time if you don't correct this some way. So this is the method that I use when I find my back against the wall and I have a colony that is already on its way to swarming. A dozen queen cells on the bottom of frames, backfilling all over the place, lots of young bees, all the signs of a swarm. So what you're going to do in this, and what the objective of is this, and I'm going to show you a graphic here in just a moment, is you're trying to separate unsealed brood and eggs from the queen. So you're getting all that young brood away from the queen. You're going to reduce overcrowding by doing this, and you're going to give the queen lots of space to lay in this process. And what ends up happening is that the queen, when you do this, the queen believes that the colony has swarmed and that the swarm pressure is off because of the conditions that you put them in. So let's take a look at that. All right, so this is our colony right here. This, again, is a swarm prevention split. This is not a spring split. The spring splits are proactive. This is a reactive split. You're reacting to a situation that you have on hand, which is a swarm situation. So we've got our colony that's ready to swarm here. We've got our brood chamber down here. We'll say we got 2 honey supers up here that are either empty. Let's say that they're empty for right now. And let's say that maybe it's not even drawn comb, because I know a lot of you as beginning beekeepers don't have a lot of drawn comb. So let's say that this colony has 2 brood boxes that are deeps, that are full of drawn comb and brood, and packed full of resources, getting ready to swarm. And we have 2 boxes that we put on top, hoping that they would expand, but they just haven't done much in there, and they haven't been able to keep up with the reproductive process. This is a scenario that many first-year beekeepers find themselves in, where they don't have enough drawn wax to facilitate resource storage, and you end up getting yourself in a situation where you have a swarm situation, even though you feel like you have space, but it's undrawn foundation that you have in these top boxes. So this is the situation we're in. What do we do? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to deconstruct this colony completely. You have to find the queen, number 1. You're going to find the queen, and you're going to put her in the bottom brood box. The queen is going to then be put in there with 2 frames of capped brood only. No young brood at all. Just 2 frames of capped brood. And in this situation, you're likely going to have a couple frames that are just wall-to-wall brood. Put those in there. That's what you're going to put down with this queen. Only 2, though. You want to make this a small colony. And by putting these 2 frames in there, what you're doing is you're basically going to give her a workforce very quickly and a place to lay in. Now, the thing you can also add in here is a food frame or 2. You can add I generally would add a pollen frame in here that has some honey on it as well. So you're going to only have 3 frames that have resources in here. 2 older brood frames, and then 1 resource frame, food frame, okay? Everything else in this box is drawn comb. It needs to be drawn comb, and it needs to be empty. So you're just filling this with tons of space. What happens is that this is your older queen. This is the queen that would have left your colony. But because of all of the lack of bees, because there's a drop in brood pheromone, there's lots of space all of a sudden, she feels like the colony has swarmed. And so the swarm impulse for her goes away, and she stays put. And that's what you're trying to do by preventing a swarm, is by getting her to stay put. She's in there. So she's in the bottom box with those 2 brood frames and a food frame. What do we do next? The next thing, you're going to put a queen excluder on top of this. And the reason is you don't want her leaving this chamber. You're going to sequester her in this bottom chamber. The next thing you're going to do is those 2 empty supers that we had on top, you're going to put those on top of that queen excluder. Now, what we're doing by adding these 2 supers is we're adding space between what's going to be 1 colony on the bottom and 1 colony on the top. And so that brood and queen pheromone is not moving as far as concentrated across that area of those 2 empty supers. And so what you end up with is a situation where you can simultaneously have queens in 2 locations without things going nuts. Your bees, your worker bees, are able to move through the queen excluders and through the supers, so they can move between colonies if they want, but typically they're going to stay with one or the other. So you got two supers for space. Now you add another queen excluder because you're going to be raising a queen on the top of this, and you don't want her to be able to go down. The last thing you're going to do is all of that uncapped, all of that young larva, all of that pollen, all of that nectar, any other capped frames that you have, all of that goes in this top box. And the last thing you're going to do is make sure there's an entrance for this top box. So I usually put a spacer on top of this with a small, opening, or you can drill a hole in the top brood box here to give them an entrance to come in and out of. What's taking place here is you have now created a situation where you have your queen on the bottom and a colony that's raising a queen on the top. So you didn't destroy any queen cells. And now you're going to put yourself in a situation where, one, you're either going to have you're going to have, essentially two queens. So what do we do with that? So after a week, you're going to go back to this colony and you're going to check the upper deep for swarm cells. So the likelihood is that you're going to have, if you did not already have swarm cells, you're going to have a whole bunch of them because now you've removed the queen. If you already had swarm cells in them when you were making this is a decision you make at that time. So you either come back after a week if you didn't have a bunch of swarm cells. Now, you can do this method before you see swarm cells. If you know you have a ton of backfilling and you see this happening in front of your eyes and you don't have space, you can proactively do this Demaree method. But if you do find yourself in a situation with lots of queen cells, this coming back in a week is going to be something you're doing actively during that time. So you need to decide what you're going to do with these queen cells, whether they are there after a week or you had them when you were making this Demaree split. You're either going to destroy them because you're trying to avert any queen rearing. You can use those queen cells also to make nukes. So you could also just start creating nukes with those frames that have cells on them before you do the Demaree split or afterwards if you didn't have any queen cells there present. Or you can just use them to raise another queen. You can essentially let that top box just go, and in 4 to 5 weeks, you're going to have a queen in there. Now, you could leave it on top of the hive. In this case, I showed you in the Demaree method, it's all located in one colony. But you could also move that top box and put it on another bottom board and create another colony that way, kind of like an even split. But this is something that you can use to basically retain that queen and make sure that your colony is not going to swarm when you get in a swarm situation. Really nice process. There are also variations of this produced by that have been developed by other folks. This is from Randy Oliver. And this is a split. This is basically splitting a colony using a modified Demaree method to take advantage of honey flow. So usually we see swarming that coincides with the beginning with honey flow. As soon as resources start coming in, things tend to get a little tight. So what you can see here is this is basically the same thing. You have your old queen that's going in the bottom box with 2 sealed brood frames. You're adding an excluder. You're putting a super on top. You can put that other box with the young bees and all of your brood on top of this with another queen excluder, or you can put it on another. You can put it, as its own hive. But essentially, the concept is that you basically wait for a little bit until the honey flow really gets rocking, and then you bring them back together to basically, you've created a big colony at that point that can take advantage of honey flow. Now, the limitation to this, Randy's in California, so his season's much longer than us. Typically, you see how there's 2 queens in this at the end, because what he's saying is basically you break this apart, you let this one raise a new queen, and then when your honey flow starts, you recombine them, and you have 2 queens, and you let them sort it out, or you take one of them. The problem for us is that we don't have enough time between the time where we start seeing honey flow and swarming to take advantage of that leisurely 4 to 5 weeks to raise a queen. So you're typically going to be basically just breaking this apart and then putting it back together just to avert the swarm in our area in northern climates. Other areas can take advantage of this much easier. But I like to show this because this is an example of something that's out there that, although it can be applicable to us, especially if we add a queen, if you were planning on raising a queen using this modified method, that's not going to work. So for us, you would be adding a queen here and then recombining once things really get rocking with the honey flow. And that's just to have a really huge colony to take advantage of honey flow. Queen rearing splits. Let's wrap up with that. So the queen rearing split, pretty darn simple. You find a frame that has queen cells on it. You can take those frames out and put them in a colony and raise a queen from it for your own personal use or to sell. You can usually do this. I usually do this in a 3-frame setup. I know folks like Mike Bush promote a 2-frame setup doing this, but I like a 3-frame setup. And basically what I mean by that is that if you find this, you find a brood frame that has lots of active queen cells on them, you take that frame and you put it in there. You evaluate what's on the frame. If it's a capped brood frame, the next frame I'm going to add in my 3-frame queen rearing split is a frame of eggs. And that's just, or eggs and young larvae, typically coinciding on the same frame, and then a frame of food as well. And that's usually what I put into my queen rearing split. The reason that I do the younger brood and the older brood is because the older brood is going to hatch very soon. That'll be the workforce that supports her. That will also be the frame that that's available for her to lay in once she comes back from her flight. But I like having that young brood because it means that I'm going to have a workforce that's still hatching out over the next 3 weeks to support her as this process is ongoing. So super simple process. A lot of times people will use the Jester boxes, like the 5-frame box that I showed you that we do nukes in, to do these types of things. I have several 10-frame deep hive bodies that I've split into 3 sections with a divider mounted in the box, so that it's essentially 3 3-frame hives in one 10-frame box, deep box. And I use that to rear queens all season, just so that I have a few queens on hand whenever I need them. So that's something to keep in mind that you can do as well. But typically when you're doing a queen rearing split, it's going to be only a couple frames of these. You're only doing it to raise queens. Once you have your queen raised, mated, and all of that good stuff, then generally what you're going to do is you're going to combine this with another colony, or you're going to just take the queen and put her in a colony, maybe it's queenless or something like that, and then you can add these frames to another colony that needs a boost of resources. Pretty nice little process. All right, final thoughts. So feeding after a split. After you do a split, you are always going to want to feed pollen and nectar. Splitting is a stressful time for bees, and just adding supplemental food is a good thing just to make sure that they have access to food during that period. Also, I had mentioned that typically when we're doing splits in the spring, it's kind of dicey weather, so you just always want to make sure that they have access to food. So making sure that you're feeding 1-to-1 sugar water during that time of the year and adding pollen patties is really good practice. You're going to want to reduce the entrances after you do your splits. This is mainly because the splits are vulnerable at this point to robbing by larger colonies, and so you want to give them less area to defend at the entrance. The placement of splits, boy, there's a lot of thoughts on where you should put your splits after you do them. And I'll tell you this, I have put splits right next to a colony I made a donation or I split from. I have put splits 30 feet away, 100 feet away, a mile away. It does not matter. The big thing you have to keep in mind when you're doing splits is you want to be getting nurse bees. If you put a split full of foragers, those foragers are going to take off and go back to the original colony. So you have to make sure that your splits have young bees in them. That is critical to make sure that they stick around. Also, plenty of brood. That brood pheromone plays an important role in keeping them to stick around. Splits are part of your job. Like I said at the beginning, it's not really your choice. The bees are going to split no matter what. They're either going to swarm on you, or you're going to play an active participant, play a role as an active participant in this process. And so you're either going to split them or they're going to split for you. And I'll tell you what, nothing is more unnerving and frustrating than seeing half of your colony fly off when you could have done something to prevent the loss of that. Swarms are not something that I take lightly. When we do have swarms, and they're very rare here, it's something that I look at as basically mismanagement. I was not on my game as a beekeeper with managing space and giving the bees what they needed when they were telling me what they needed by giving me all of these signals like backfilling, queen cells, wall-to-wall brood, all of these things that we talk about that happens during spring buildup. And the other thing is that you're going to fail. We all do. That's part of the learning process, and it's why taking education programs is so important, because we limit that failure by knowing a little bit more in depth about the biology of the organism. But you're going to fail. When I started doing splits, oftentimes I'd go back to a box and there'd be nothing left. They just up and left after I did it, or the queen failed or something like that. All sorts of things are going to happen as you're doing this. But remember what I told you at the beginning. I've been doing this now for 15 years, and we've been selling bees for a decade. And what I'll tell you is that really the thing that to keep in mind when it comes to producing these colonies is making sure, absolutely sure, that you are ready for this process, that you have a game plan. The whole thing about if you have an overwintered colony, you need to make a split. So you need to start early when you see these things happening. Like when you have a colony that made it through the winter, you need to be planning for that split. Where am I going to get my queens? What am I going to do? Am I going to sell it? Am I going to keep it? These are questions you need to ask yourself. And just make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you're getting started. But the big thing is just keep trying it. The absolute worst thing that can happen by doing a split is it doesn't do well, and you end up recombining it back with a colony that you already had. So you're not going to lose out very much. There's not a lot of risk associated with it. You can always recombine, but it's worth trying, and you definitely are going to have to do it, especially in northern climates. The colonies just take off so quickly in the spring that swarming is inevitable if you don't do a split on an overwintered colony. Even some first-year colonies will swarm because they just don't have enough drawn comb. So something to keep in mind. But these are some practices you can use in your own operation to help support you as you're going through this process. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll see you at the next one.